I think it's pretty easy to see that any application that's of use in the real world is going to need a way to retrieve data from somewhere. And this will typically be data that's stored in a database and is served up through some backend. And the app's also going to need a way to send data to the backend and then store it in the database. Now let's take a step back and think about traditional round-trip applications again. In a traditional round-trip application, you would make a request to the server for a given page, and that page would be served to you in the form of HTML and any other assets like images or styles or whatever. And typically any of the data that would be required for that view would be sent along as well. The data might be fetched on the back end from some database and then kind of strung together into the HTML and then delivered back to your browser. But as we know, single page applications work differently than this. With a single page app, we get everything we need at the start, and then we can manipulate the page to change what the user sees within that single page. But for a single page app, we still need a way to persist data in a database. And the best way to do this for a full-out single page application, like the one that we're building, is to use a data API. And so for our purposes, let's think of a data API as a kind of program that we can interact with that is responsible for serving us data in the form of JSON or JavaScript object notation, or taking data that we send it and then storing it in a database. And so what ends up happening when you create a data API is that you basically write an application on the server. And these applications will then have logic to retrieve data from a database or store data into a database and do other things like email users and run scheduled jobs and that sort of thing. And so you sort of have a self-contained program that lives on a server. And that program can then expose itself to the world in the form of an API. And it does so by exposing its data. So then on the front end, on the client side, which is what Angular does, Angular allows us to build client-side applications, we basically build another application that is responsible for consuming data. And after it consumes that data, it does things like displays certain data to the user, and then it'll take a user's input and send data back to the API. So I kind of like to think of this as two separate machines. We have our front-end machine here on the left, and it's a self-contained program. It's got a whole bunch of capability. It can do things all on its own, but it's by itself, and it doesn't have any kind of communication with the outside world. It doesn't have communication with anything beyond the user's browser. And then here on the right, we've got our server-side application, which is contained unto itself as well. And then I like to think of the server-side application as exposing itself through a set of wires. And you can sort of think of those wires as the data API. And these wires are exposed and they're ready to be plugged into something. And we can make it possible for our front-end application, our Angular app, to have those wires plugged into it by creating the proper connection. Basically, we have to create some sort of port in this front-end machine so that it can fit the wires or the data API that's being exposed by the server side. Now, there's a lot of different ways to design a data API and different ways to make it publicly available to be consumed by some front end. And probably the best way to create an API is to create what's known as a RESTful API. And this can be thought of as a set of data resources. So I'll show you what I mean by taking an example from GitHub. Now, GitHub has an API that's publicly accessible, and it's at api.github.com. And we can do an example here. We can find all the GitHub users that this API is exposing. So like I said, a data API should expose JSON data. And that's what we've got here from GitHub's API. We've got them giving us a list of their users in JSON format. And so each of these objects has some properties like their usernames and IDs and their avatar URLs and that sort of thing. And so part of the design of a RESTful resource API is to be able to dig deeper into that resource. And so let's say we wanted to get some more information on this first user here. So we could just copy that username and we could put it onto the end of our URL after users. And we go there and we see some more information like a name, company, location, that sort of thing. So if I wanted to dig deeper and get, say, the list of followers that this user has, well, I can just tack that on to the end here and I get a list of this user's followers. So this is how a RESTful resource API is set up, and it's arguably the best way to craft an API to serve data. Now, the fact that this API exposes its data in JSON format is really important for the web because JSON format is a really compact and easy to use way to transport data. As a consequence, if we make a request to this URL from our Angular application, we're going to get back this list of data in JSON format, and it will be really easy for us to manipulate it right away. And if we think about it, the way that this data is formatted is pretty well the same as we've got our example data in our controller. If we go back to the controller, we see that we've got an array of objects, and each object represents a classified add. And we know that this is easy to work with because we were able to make use of it right away here within our template. In the same way, if we were able to get a hold of this data from its remote source here on GitHub's API, we could use it immediately within our Angular application. And fortunately, Angular actually gives us a couple of really good resources for working with remote data sources. We'll see what those are and how to use them in the next lesson.